Hello everyone, I'm Zinhani Mary from I Love Tata, and I thought we could do a little Excel macro tutorial today. I think it's a very useful little feature in Excel, and I think it's easy to learn. We will focus on the basics, so if someone already has experience with Excel macros, this isn't for them. But if someone is just getting familiar with the concepts, then I think a very useful little tutorial video is being made. If you like the video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Let's get started. So here's our little example we'll be working with. And first we are going to look at macro recording. You can find it by looking at the tabs above, and on the right side of the View tab, there is a section for macros and an option for Record Macro. It's important to know that by default in Excel, if you have never written a macro and you haven't enabled it either, and if you have used the macros in the past, macro executions are disabled, so you need to enable them beforehand. You can do this by going to the settings in the PHI menu, to the Privacy Center's privacy settings, where you must enable the macro settings. Although it doesn't recommend this, macros are often very useful for work, so it's worth enabling them. You can also enable or disable ActiveX and other add-ons, and you can hide these stop bars if they bother you when such message bars appear. Let's move on. So now we've enabled macro execution. Here we have a show macros option, and if there is already a macro in our Excel file, it will appear here. If not, we can create one here. Start record. We can do this by recording a macro. We will soon begin with how to record a macro and what it's good for. Let's get started. So recording a macro, we'll give it a name. Let's say in this case it will be a test. In this workbook we are currently in, we want to record a macro here. Macros can only be recorded in XLSM. It can be in a file format or the old XLSXL or possibly XLSB. If we make a simple XLSX and save a macro in it, when you close Excel it gets lost, but Excel will warn you about this. So this is an XLSM file, and I've now started recording a macro. You can tell because there's a stop button here, which if pressed will stop the recording. What happens when we record? For instance, in this cell I write something. I'll enter 5, 6 here, and let's say I'll divide this one. No, typing is a tricky thing, and then we got a number. Now we'll stop the macro recording, and if we look at the macro display, the test macro we created has appeared. If we go into editing here, there's an edit button. We can see what happened. We entered something in cell S3, 6 in S4, 5 in S5, and in S6 an active cell formula. R1C, this means we entered a formula here, and with -1 and -2, it shows where the cell is relative to itself that was being worked on, and a slash, which generally indicates division. So let's see. It's really great that we recorded this. Why is it good? Now I'll delete what we recorded, and we'll rerun this test macro. See what I typed in manually earlier. The macro inserted automatically. This is really useful, for example. It can be used for two things. If there is a task that is repetitive and requires doing the same thing over and over, you can automate it with this. The other thing it's great for is if you don't know any Visual Basic code on how to write or display in a macro, you can type in a formula or something and it will translate it for you. You do not need to figure out how to write that formula yourself. But let's continue. In the meantime, I prepared for this material yesterday and created a little macro which I captured in an image now so you can see it larger. You see, when you open a macro window, the text appears quite small, and I thought it might not show well on YouTube, so I saved it separately as an image. We'll discuss the theory and then I'll show you how it looks in practice. So every macro starts with a name which we can change. For this little snippet, I named it macro learning panakatamoshe to avoid creating something fixed, like in the case of macro recording, where we input specific values like 5 and 6 and instead have something automated. We need variables. A variable is something that can hold a value which we can then use to perform operations. What I mean is, for example, if we have a field containing a number that we want to multiply, divide, or perform some operation with, we can store it in a variable. We often use variables for iteration too, which we'll discuss shortly. And for iteration, we also use variables. We will continue with the dim keyword, the variable's name, and then the format or type of the variable. Let's take a look. Here, I created a variable named I, and I did this so that I can use it for iteration. And double, I assigned it a double numerical value, although an integer would have been more than enough for our small Excel table. But an integer can only store numbers up to 37,000 integers. This is how it stores the numbers. Beyond that, it overflows, meaning we get an error message. So if we're working with very large data, using double is more useful. That's why I typically use double by default, but for smaller data, integer is more than enough. Then I created a text variable, which is string, meaning text in string format. There's also date, so you could have dim. Date is date, and then this is a date variable. The language of the macro is English, so every command is basically an English word. So let's take a look and then move on. It's advisable to always assign an initial value to our variable. In this case, I gave both A and B an initial value of 1 and assigned an empty value to the text. Why is this useful? Why is this important? In every programming language, it is advisable to give variables an initial value, because during execution, they can take on various values. And if we're calculating and a value is already present, it starts calculating with that existing value. So it's good if we set the initial value ourselves to ensure it contains what we want it to. In this case, it's necessary to give an initial value to this I, because we will use it for iteration. And the value of I is 1. We created a for loop that goes from 1 to 10. Why is a loop beneficial for us? A loop is useful for iteration. Here I've written a very simple for loop that goes from 1 to 10, and for each row it writes the number 1 in the 20th column of that row. Let's take a look at how it runs, and then we'll see what it actually does. Our little macro has run, and it does other things too, but we'll look at that separately. First, I'll explain this little for loop. So this goes from 1 to 10 if we check the macro, and everywhere in each row it has entered a 1. So here's our little for loop. It first picks up day 1. At this point, the value of I is 1, and the other value cell is 20. Therefore, the value of the first row's 20th column should be set to equal 1. Then it increments it. At this point, it takes the value of 2. So now it's at the second stage from 1 to 10. The inner part is the second row, the 20th column, value is 1, and it continues up to 10. We can see perfectly well that our little macro which we wrote writes 10 number ones here for us. That's great. We can already write a for loop, and if we enter formulas or conditions for a given number of lines, our for loop will iterate up to that maximum number and do what we want. But let's pause here. If we can already write a for loop, let's look at something a bit more complicated. There is also a while loop. which is similar to the for loop, except the for loop is a pre-test loop and the while loop is a post-test loop. People say this from a programming perspective, and it's generally considered to be complicated, but it isn't. The for loop continues until it reaches 10, then it finishes. The while loop, on the other hand, continues until a specific condition is met. In this case, I mean a while loop that as long as I check whether the element in the first column is empty, if it is not empty, then it runs through. So this is a pre-test loop, because if the condition is not met, it moves forward. In the for loop, when it reaches 10, it runs and then it's finished. So Costa, let's take a look. Here's what happens. We have this data in Excel, and the while loop goes through the first row and it keeps moving until it reaches the last row, which is a 701. The loop continues until then. Then in each row, you know, the row where our current step is, because the variable I is incrementing the index, it selects that row and assigns it a formula. In this case, it will divide the two numbers, namely -9 and -12, relative to 17. Specifically, if I remember correctly, I divide the number of items sold by the sales cross value to determine the cost per item, creating a meaningful little loop. This goes through completely. So when I run the macro, so here on the side you can see that our little text has run and you can see that it divided one number by the other. So we don't have to write it all out manually. We can do this automatically without having to manually write out the formula. This is really useful in cases where every week we need to repetitively apply formulas to a table, create a pivot table, or reports as they are also known, or consistently perform some task. We can do this automatically without manual work. And it automatically goes to the bottom of the data because our loop runs as long as it finds data. Here, when it reaches this point and there is no next row, it exits the loop and the macro continues running. There is another part of macros which is the if statement, because often we might have tasks where we want to do something based on certain conditions. Here I've chosen a totally silly example, but it's great for demonstrating what the if does. The if is basically if. It can also be read as if. If the sales value in the row we are currently in has the second value as Canada, then it writes a K in the I-18 value as Canada in Hungarian. And here it should exit the if, meaning the if condition. So what happens is, as the loop iterates, the loop, the loop, the loop, the loop. So if the country field has the value Canada, it writes Canada. Otherwise, it leaves it empty, because if the condition that Canada is in column B is not met, the if doesn't do anything and exits this branch. So here, if the value is Canada, it only writes Canada with a K, otherwise it does nothing. You can also write an end if here, or another if, so you could translate all the countries into Hungarian like this, and then you could automatically process them. Or you could do something like you can use else if to handle what happens if the value is not Canada. Let's try it out. If you enter this here and we say that this is the same field where Canada is written, and you enter this is not Canada, then we run this. I will delete it so that we can see it. And then we run it. So it shows that the first one was Canada, the second row is not Canada, so they entered not Canada here, but we can also input statements, and we could do this for all the countries, automatically reformatting them. Basically, the if function is useful for doing something to a specific cell under certain conditions, such as dividing, multiplying, giving it a value, or examining its content. In summary, I have introduced you to the fundamental building blocks of programming, primarily loops and conditionals. A condition is practically from what you can build almost anything. It's a very good starting point for beginning to learn loops. I think VBA, Excel macros, or even as a programming foundation, they are very good. Because of course, you might have some data that you want to iterate over and do something with. And then you want to determine what something is and give instructions. For example, if a value is such and such, then divide, multiply, subtract, write it out, rewrite, and to another sheet. Of course, there are many more instructions beyond this. For example, there is a formatter that colors things in blue. You can even create graphs automatically with an Excel macro. So there are many things you can do. I've written an FTP program, so this is really just the basics, but I think it's the most important foundation of VBA and programming. If you liked it, then give it a like, subscribe, and if there's anything else you'd like to know about this, or if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching. Bye.